I want to welcome everybody at 9:31. We'll get started.
Hello.
It's nice to see Phyllis this morning and Jack Pariser joining us, Ahuva Ho, and Barbara Baim. Barbara, is this Joe's yurt site today?
She's
Oh,
on mute.
so today
Not
will
on
be
mute.
dedicated to the yurt site, the first yurt site of Joe Baim, who with Barbara has been an important part of our community, our extended family. I'm glad we can honor Joe with study this morning. This morning is a psalm that's actually linked to Hanukkah. On this, the fifth day of Hanukkah, let me say a word about Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a war that was fought not to conquer land, but to assert freedom. Some historians say it's the first war fought for religious freedom. And at the center of that story is the temple. And I highlight that because at the center of Psalm 74, our study today, is the temple as well and destruction. In that regard, I show our latest edition of Chanukiot, which is a gift from our son John, who, God willing, will get his COVID vaccine tomorrow at Mount Sinai. And this, of course, is Ruth Bader Ginsburg with, I Dissent. And it's particularly appropriate for Hanukkah because what's dramatic about the Hanukkah story is that it was a people that dissented from Hellenism. As the Greeks swept through with Alexander the Great, conquering the Near East, he did so as a conqueror who sought to create a universal people linked by culture. In Hellenism, there was room for tolerance, many faiths. All one had to do is pay tribute to the authorities and acknowledge Greek culture as modernity. The Jews were a particularly difficult colony for the Greeks in that the Jews were asserting a belief in only one God, not polytheism, but monotheism. And in that regard, as Alexander the Great's conquest was divided between the Ptolemy in Egypt, the Seleucid in kind of Syria, Iran, and then Macedonia and the Greeks. The Seleucids, there would be a back and forth, but the Seleucids would be in control of the land of Israel. Antiochus is somebody who was naturalized as a Greek citizen, and the Israelites were difficult. The Jews were a difficult colony. They again believed in only one God, did not believe in graven images, and some said that his face had been rubbed off on coins as a form of Jews rebelling against idolatry. And so with Antiochus Epiphanes, there was a assertion that the temple was to be polytheistic, that Zeus was to have an altar there, that there would be offerings brought to the emperor. And so in the year 167 before the Common Era, there was rebellion led by priests. Mattathias was a priest in the hills, beginning a guerrilla war against these Syrian Greek lords. Well, our psalm, Psalm 74, focuses on this theme of independence, of Jerusalem with a temple that is a symbol of that quality of independence of worship, of a God who is a creator who cares about justice. The temple was built by Solomon around the year, a little after the year 1000 before the Common Era, and it would be destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 586 before the Common Era, meaning over 400 years of a central place of worship. Mind you, 1 out of 3 pages of the Bible, 1 out of 3 pages, deal with worship of God in one form or another around the tabernacle, bringing gifts to God, knowing how to dress and perform rituals to bring community together. When the first temple is destroyed, it is a time of enormous trauma, not only because of enormous destruction, but because of a loss of a sense of self, of identity, of worship. Listen to these words from the Book of Lamentations, which we chant at, also in Hebrew, Echa, that we chant on Tisha B'Av. In blazing anger, he has cut down all the might of Israel. He, God, has withdrawn his right hand in the presence of the foe. He has ravaged Jacob like flaming fire, consuming on all sides. Verse 5, the Lord has acted like a foe, laid waste Israel, laid waste all her citadels, destroyed her strongholds, has increased within fair Judah mourning and moaning. God has stripped God's booth like a garden, destroyed God's tabernacle. The Lord has ended in Zion festival and Sabbath. In God's raging anger, God has spurned king and priest. For the prophets, the enemy was a vehicle of God, because God was supreme in power, a punishment for sin. And more, God had a covenant who would remember Israel and allow for the rebuilding of that temple. And indeed, within 70 years, as Jeremiah had prophesied. So Babylonia was conquered by the Persians, and Cyrus the Great would give the green light for the Israelites to return and rebuild the temple, which would then get destroyed, that second temple, in the year 70 by the Romans. Well, to Psalm 74. This is entitled, They Set on Fire Your Holy Place. It doesn't say when. It doesn't say in the psalm itself what was the exact event, though most commentators would identify it like that description of the Book of Lamentations as the destruction of the first temple. But as we know, as the rabbis are reading this psalm, they're reading this psalm wherever they are, particularly in the Middle Ages, in diaspora, as a description of longing for return. They're reading it not only as a description of the first temple, they will also read it as a description of the Hanukkah story and the longing and the success in reclaiming the temple. And they will describe this Psalm 74 as the anthem of diaspora, a psalm that longs for reclaiming the land, and the symbol of that reclamation is the reclaiming of the sanctuary. With that said, keeping one eye on the clock, it's time to read to you Psalm 74. It's one moment, I forgot to open. All right, now I'll bring it up. Psalm 74. And as is my way, I tend to title the Psalms from a key verse. I will acknowledge, just for you to have kind of a guide before I begin to read, that this psalm is composed of 4 parts. The first 3 verses will be an introduction. Then verses 4 to 12 will be describing the present as ongoing destruction. Then verses 13 to 17, the third part, will be looking to the past, describing God's power of deliverance. And the last, verses 18 to 23, will look to the future, calling on God to create change. A maskil of Asaph. Why, God, do you abandon endlessly? Smoldering is your anger against the flock of your tending. Remember your community whom you acquired long ago. You redeemed the tribe of your inheritance, this Mount Zion where you dwell. Lift up your footsteps toward the destruction, ongoing. All the desecration of the enemy in the holy place. They roared your foes inside your meeting place. They placed their own signs as signs. It was known to reverberate above as in a thicket of axes, as in a thicket of trees, axes. And now at its entrance, all together with hatchet and hammers they pounded. They set on fire your holy place. To the ground they profaned the dwelling place of your name. They said in their hearts, let us make havoc of them altogether. They burned all the meeting places of Ale in the land. Our signs we do not see. There is no longer a prophet, nor is there among us anyone who knows how long. How long, God, will the adversary scorn? Shall the enemy mock your name endlessly? Why do you withdraw your hand? Your right hand from amidst your bosom, take it out. Yet God is my majesty from long ago, working deliverance in the midst of the land. You shattered with your strength the sea. You smashed the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave it as food to the people of the wilderness. You split open springs and streams. You dried up the surging rivers. To you is the day, also to you is the night. You established luminary and sun. You set all the boundaries of the earth, summer and winter. You formed them. Remember this, how the enemy has scorned Adonai, and how a base people have mocked your name. Do not deliver to the wild beast the spirit of your turtle dove, the life of your poor. Do not forget endlessly. Look to the covenant, for full are the dark places of a land of habitations of violence. Do not let the oppressed turn back in shame. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Arise, God. Argue your argument. Remember your scorn from the vile person all day long. Do not forget the voice of your foes, the clamor of those who rise up against you, ascending always. And so the psalm ends incompletely. All too often, we've seen in earlier psalms, the closing line pulls it together with praise of God, as if I trust you, God. That's kind of the formula. You may put out your plea, but you end with hope and gratitude, faith. Here, this psalm ends with a plea, just like it began. This psalm began, if it's a supplication, in an odd way, namely questioning God. Why, God, do you abandon endlessly? It feels unending, which again, you could see how this would become an anthem of galut, of dispersion, of homelessness for the Jewish people, as this psalm would become a central psalm, although remarkably not a psalm that found its way into liturgy in an ongoing way, but was a psalm that was turned to express longing. And yet, as I noted, there is this sense of incompleteness, of calling on God to remember. The word remember appears 3 times, verses 2, 18, and 22. And al tishkach, don't forget, that appears twice. So there's a sense that God is the God of a covenant, of a relationship, of a history with the people. And that's the context for hope. The past gives hope for the future. And indeed, there's another word that appears over and over, and that is lanetzach. We see it in verse 1. Endlessly. We get endlessly, lanetzach, second line, the last word. Why, God, do you abandon endlessly? Both to reflect God who is eternal, but you will also have it, this concept, as the last word. It's the envelope. You ascending always. Here it's a different word. It's tamid. It's always. The sense of God transcending time and yet living in a time that feels as if it's open-ended in a way that's a source of anxiety, of incompleteness. And so the first 3 verses, which are the introduction, really sum up the whole psalm. It begins with this questioning of God, and we'll get more questioning of God later on, which is also kind of interesting. We'll get it in verse 11. In fact, let me go to verse 11 and then back to the beginning. Verse 11, why do you withdraw your hand? Your right hand from amidst your bosom, take it out. There's this quality of pleading with God to take action. It's a psalm where I put in a number of exclamation points, I think 3, because there's the sense of such urgency. And look at verse 10. Urgency among what feels endless, which is the mocking of the enemy. It's not only the destruction, it's the sense that they who destroyed, or later on in medieval times, those among whom we live, for whom we become a symbol of God's rejection of us, of a new Israel, they mock us, and thereby they mock you. Martin Cohen, in his analysis of this psalm, will raise the question, when people mock Israel, do they not simultaneously mock God? For Israel is identified with God. And so back to the beginning, the introduction foreshadowing what will unfold in Psalm 74, there's a sense of feeling abandoned by God, that God is smoldering in anger against the flock. The last word, the flock of your tending, for some, because the nature of poetry, particularly with Hebrew, can have more than one translation, and there it's the flock of your pastures instead of tending. Translations will go in both ways. And then this key word, remember. Remember your community, whom you acquired long ago. There's a long history. And the word Ga'alta in verse 2, Goel, has a legal significance. A Goel is a redeemer within the family. That's the whole notion in the Bible. If somebody dies without a child, their next of kin must be the redeemer. And so there's a sense of, God, you have a duty to redeem the tribe of your inheritance. Mount Zion, where you dwell. It's not only your relationship with us, it's your relationship to the land itself that has your sanctuary. And now again, verse 3, that's the key. So verse 1 is feeling as if there's an unending abandonment. Verse 2 is looking to the past. And verse 3 is looking to the future. Lift up your footsteps toward the destruction. Ongoing. Again, that emphasis. Ongoing. Netzach. That same word that was in verse 1. The desecration. Kol Ra. All the evil, the desecration of the enemy of your holy place. Some would translate this as simply sanctuary, but to keep it as it's in the Hebrew as holy place is to emphasize the connection to God as holiness. And now that, again, that second section, beginning with verse 4, that sense of destruction, and you can hear it. And that's how it begins. The foe is roaring with cries of victory. And now another word for that sacred place, Moadecha, your meeting place. And here they place their own signs as signs can mean a variety of things. And I translate it literally, signs as signs. It can be their banners of victory. It can be understood as a metaphor. They place their own declarations of victory as the ultimate victory. Or it can be understood as their signs of God, their idols. They place their idols, their Zeus, in the sanctuary. And here, again, literally, H-E-A-R, you can hear the sound of the walls, of the doors, with hatchets and hammers being destroyed. Verse 6, which I translate as entrances, as do many, can also be understood, pitucheha, in the description of the tabernacle, as the carvings. So there, for some commentators, the pounding with hatchets and hammers is the quality of desecration that they're going against all the engravings carved into the walls of the cherubim, of beauty, the art that was created to sanctify God's holy place. And they are saying in their hearts this word, ninam, let us make havoc. I translate it as, is a word that only appears here in the Bible. And so, of course, as the nature of these hapax is, Rashi understands it as monarchy. Let us make a monarchy. Radak as let us cause damage. Sforno, may future generations of them all together. They burned all the meeting places of El. And here, back to the same word for sign. You see in verse 7, they place their own signs as signs. Now our signs, ototenu, we do not see. There is no longer a prophet, nor is there among us anyone who knows how long. And the Talmud will comment in Sanhedrin 96b, in terms of this part leading up to it, that the conqueror named Nebuzaradon, the Babylonian conqueror general, will express, at least as the Talmud has him speaking, the pride of being the first to do what no one else had ever done, destroy the palace of the God of the Jews. And regarding taking again this pride of destruction, and then in verse 9, in terms of the Talmud again, Sanhedrin 11a, Yoma 9b, Sota 48b, will say that with the last prophets, and this is actually not First Temple, but moving closer to the time of the Maccabees, which again is that 2nd century before the Common Era, with the deaths of Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. The spirit of prophecy departed from Israel. And so some of the later rabbis will put this not in regard to the first temple, but the second temple. All possible, for no date is given. And now, just going forward with one eye on the clock, we shift to that next section, that third section, which looks to the past. You shattered with your strength the sea, that is the sea monsters. You smashed the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed the heads of the Leviathan. This is a description of God's power, building on a Canaanite myth of how Baal had destroyed the primordial sea monster. At least that's how modern Bible scholars read this imagery. It was common in Canaan, in Canaan, as the image of Baal, to have the strength who set order by destroying the sea monsters. And here, that description is carried forward. I'll foreshadow Psalm 104, verse 26, which will have God playing with the Leviathan, a particular kind of sea monster. And now, shifting from God creating order, from conquering disorder to creating order, here we get God, you establish day and night, luminary, the moon, the sun, boundaries of seasons, which is to say, God, in these verses 13 to 17, you're the creator. You established nature. You conquered, building on this myth, you conquered any chaos within creation. And therefore, back to remember that word which was part of the introduction in verse 2. Remember this, Zachor Zot, how the enemy has scorned Adonai, how a base people have mocked your name. And so, God, you take action not only because you love us, but because you know this enemy, in destroying your temple and destroying your people, is simultaneously mocking you. Where's your pride, God? Do not deliver the wild beast, that's the enemy, the spirit, to this, the turtle dove. The turtle dove is the image of Israel, a gentle bird, a turtle dove identified with monogamy, faithfulness, and the life of your poor. That's us. We're the poor. We're the neglected. Do not forget endlessly. Back to the opening. It feels also endless. Look to the covenant, that agreement you made with our ancestors. Do not let the oppressed, that's Israel, turn back in shame. Let the poor and needy, that's Israel, praise your name. And now the end. Arise, God. And 22 and 23 flow together. Arise, God. I use argue your argument, which is like Psalm 35 verse 1 begins the same way. Riva Adonai et Yerivei. Strive, God, your striving, or argue your argument. Remember your scorn from the vile person all day long. Do not forget the voice of your foes, the clamor of those who rise up against you, ascending always. Robert Alter translates this last phrase, the din of those against you, perpetually rising. Well, to pull it together, because it's 10, and there's so much more that's to be said, and hopefully will in reaction to some of your comments. This is a psalm that is simultaneously pessimistic and optimistic. It's pessimistic in that it looks squarely at loss. It looks squarely at what appears to be unending. A destroyed Israel, a destroyed temple, a desecrated place of once dignity, now mockery. And at the same time, it's optimistic because God has a history with the people, and more, God has the power to triumph. And so Psalm 74 calls on God to remember, not to forget, 5 times. The land of Israel, the word Eretz, repeated 5 times. The word Lanetzach, forever, 4 times. The words for mockery, 5 times. Like so many of the Psalms, this is a weave of repetition, but the most repeated word in Psalm 74, Ata, you, repeated 7 times. You, 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 you. The sense is that the psalmist has a relationship with God, that the psalmist can address God directly. And as we have seen, the ability, which is grounded in faith, to speak to God out of darkness is the greatest source of light, of hope. Hence, the symbol of hope, light of the menorah. All right, with this as a psalm well suited for Hanukkah, I now try to see all of you. It's wonderful to see who's appeared, to see that we have 20 screens. Psalm 74, I welcome your reactions and questions. One second, I got to get the Kaddish opened up here for after. Okay, now I get this. Now I see you all again. Reactions to Psalm 74. Go ahead, Jack, and then Arnold. Jack Pariser.
I would say this is a psalm of great naivety.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Say more,
We,
Jack.
we don't accept or don't visualize that God could get angry and decouple.
So let me react to Jack, who my beloved friend, speaking to us from Seattle. There's a naivete, perhaps, a naivete that sees God, one, here's a fancy term, anthropopathic, which means giving to God human emotion, a God who gets angry, whose temper is smoldering. So that can be, on some level, naive if taken literally. So I agree with Jack. Many people take these images of God's emotions literally. I too would frame that as naive, but we are only human, and we who have emotions naturally project onto God emotions because we seek relationship with God. But here's what's not naive about this psalm. I began with reading from the book of Lamentations. We don't know who wrote it. Some modern scholars say Jeremiah. It's a description of the destruction of the first temple. On Tisha B'Av, when we chant the book of Lamentations, we do so as if the past is the present. It's traditional to chant it without lights in the room. So as sitting on the floor with candles. There's that wonderful story told, it may be false, but it's a wonderful story, of Napoleon walking by a synagogue and hearing wailing coming from inside and sending one of his officers to see what's going on. Why are they crying in the streets, in a building in Paris? And the general comes back and he says, that's a religious service. The Jews are mourning the destruction of their temple. And Napoleon in this story says, well, when was their temple destroyed? And they say, well, it was like 1600 years ago. To which Napoleon says, a people that can mourn a temple as if it was destroyed yesterday are a people that will one day rebuild their temple. And that's to say, when one lives history as an immediacy of one's, as if it was one's own experience, what is naive can become a marvel. namely a reclaiming in our own time the longing for Jerusalem, the longing for a rebuilt national identity that enables a reclaimed dignity. And so Psalm 74 is a psalm that lives the past across generations as an expression of longing for a new and different tomorrow. Arnold, you were next.
Well, my reaction was that that the people felt abandoned by God, but what might have been even worse is if God abandoned them permanently, and which comes out to me in that last line. The concern that God might abandon the people forever, and
Yeah.
that's even worse than call it a temporary abandonment.
So when you say that, Arnold, where my mind goes is being Rashi, living in France, Christian country, 11th century, the end of his life, the Crusades beginning, and the sense for Rashi, or after him, Ibn Ezra also, living in that time of the Crusades, the sense that somehow we are, on one hand, abandoned. We have no power. We have no army. We have no ability to go back and retake our land. And it feels unending, that powerlessness. And that is, of course, the greatest fear, that this is permanent. And yet, that's where this psalm, written probably 1,000 years before Rashi, or 500 years before Rashi, we don't know its dating, is an expression of hope at the same time. Because the word that keeps getting repeated in this psalm to God 5 times, 3 times remember, 2 times don't forget, which is to say, we have a relationship. You, God, I'm talking to you, is a part of what gives one hope that God has the power to make the change. It will not be unending. But this psalm repeats that word endlessly 4 times. That's the fear. Yeah. Take one more because of the time. One more comment to honor and react to. Barbara, I'm so glad Barbara is here. I'm going to pause now before Barbara Boehm speaks to honor Joe Boehm, who was a fighter in that he was a lawyer, and he was a lawyer who could, when needed, fight the fight. That line here, I love that line. Arise, God, argue your argument. It's like, step up, make do your thing. And so, Barbara, go ahead. You got to unmute. So if you push, I don't know if you have, there you go. Go ahead, Barbara.
Couldn't this be today's society when people are giving up hope?
Yeah. We in today's society.
And why doesn't God take care of us at this point in time?
So
we have the vaccine, but 300,000 people have died.
Right. Well, today, this is really the day after, right? Yesterday was the first day of people getting vaccines. It's wonderful to listen to the podcast this morning, the New York Times Daily, in which focuses on yesterday's first people receiving the vaccine and the sense of change, of hope, of this will not necessarily be forever. But hopelessness is defined as forever. Hopelessness is defined as being in a box with no way out. That's the experience of deep depression. A person in deep depression feels, this is sadly something I learned firsthand in my 20s, is the experience of being closed off, closed in, self-mocking, no change, no way out. And that is part of the power of this kind of psalm. This kind of psalm, all the more, living when we live, with the sweep of history, knowing that in this case, Jews were able to return to the land of Israel after 2,000 years of exile. This is a psalm about displacement, which felt for people in the midst of Galut as if it would never change, that they would never reclaim power to be able to assert military choice and dignity and build a future. And likewise, whatever we face in our lives, and COVID has been a pandemic, meaning the whole world has shared in a quality of, will this never end? Can we do nothing about it? I remember, because it was when I was living in New York working with AIDS patients in the hospitals, in which they didn't know what caused AIDS and how to fight AIDS. You see somebody today like Magic Johnson, HIV positive for years, with science having stepped forward to allow people now to live lives where in the mid-'80s there was a sense of hopelessness. And in sum, to pull this together, Hanukkah, I dissent, is a way of saying that if one culls core values and believes that those values are embedded in creation itself, I don't think that's naive. I think that that's both hope-making and real when one has a bigger canvas of time, that there is reason to be hopeful in this, the week of Hanukkah, in this, the week of the first COVID vaccines. May, again, the experience of darkness lead to a return to dignity and normalcy. And with that, with so much more to say, I know there are many who are here to say Kaddish also to honor the past as part of our enduring present in your lives, and to honor on this occasion Joe Boehm's first yurtzeit. And so I invite those who honor a loved one to conclude our study, as is customary, with the saying of Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'alma divrah v'yam malchutei b'chayechon u'vyomechon u'chayei all Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehesh Rabba Barach Olam Le'omaya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitrama V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei V'kudsha V'richu Le'ela Minkol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechemata Damiram V'yama V'imram Yehei Lama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'yokol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'imrumav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'yokol Yisrael V'kol Yisrael Tevel V'imru Amen. Wishes to all of a happy Hanukkah on this, the first yurtzeit of Joe Boehm. I say to Barbara, Yeh zichrono livracha, may Joe's memory endure for you and all of us who knew him as a blessing. Happy Hanukkah. Have a good day.